I now call on Daniel Johnson to wind up the debate for around 8 minutes. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is a housing emergency. That's not really up for debate. The choice this evening is whether or not we want to acknowledge that crisis, that emergency, treat it as such, because it's only with that acknowledgement that we'll treat it with the urgency and the focus that it deserves. I think the tragedy of this afternoon has been there was an opportunity. There was no need for the government to disagree with what we had in front of us. It could have been an opportunity to have that frank discussion about how we tackle these problems, looking at the solutions and coming together with a degree of consensus. And indeed, I think there's been quite a strong contrast between the front bench and the back bench contributions from the government benches this afternoon. I think that we've had some of that thoughtful discussion from the SNP backbenches. Unfortunately, we've not had it from the front bench. In fact, they want to wipe out the word emergency. Apparently, all we're facing is significant pressure, and only amongst those who are homeless. Tell that to private renters in Edinburgh. Tell that to anyone looking for a house. Tell that anyone to facing homelessness. It's not significant pressure. It's an emergency. But the other critical problem with what the government has presented this afternoon is it actually fails to really acknowledge the fundamental problem. They've talked about initiatives, they've talked about conversations. Fundamentally, we have a problem of housing supply. Now, if you slice that and dice that, you look at particular categories, you will not acknowledge the full problem. And the simple reality is this. On average, the SNP have built 5,000 fewer houses than we did when we were in power. Between 1997 and 2007, 230... just a moment. 200. I will come to Mr. Sweeney in a moment. 230,000 between 2007 and 2022. 260,000 homes were built. In other words, under the SNP, it took them 15 years to build as many houses as we built in 10. That is the simple reality. If we had continued to build houses at the same rate when we left power, there would be 104,000 more homes in Scotland than there is today. Those are what the simple numbers tell you. Happy to wait, Mr.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Johnson for giving me the only slight flaw in the contorted information he has just given to Parliament is that it ignores factors such as the financial crash in 2008, which led to a hemorrhage of private building, which had nothing to do with the Scottish Government and everything to do with the financial mismanagement of the last Labour Government in the UK.
There is a serious point here. These are the simple numbers. I didn't make any attributions. I said that you have to acknowledge that the fundamental point of supply, and unless you recognise that, you will never make progress. And the simple reality is, and I think Sarah Boyack put it very well, is that at the heart of these numbers is a human experience. I think the fact that she raised that 45% of homeless people face severe and significant mental health consequences is something I think we should all be reflecting on. And I have to say, it's something I think about a lot during my surgeries. And I hate the fact when I am faced with people living in cramped accommodation, families of 5 or 6 living in 2-bedroom flats, and I have to tell them, because of the points on the Ed Index system, that they're going to have to wait years. It's inhumane. And until you fix supply, that will continue to be a problem. And it's why you have to face up to the emergency, face up to the fact that a family is being made homeless every 16 minutes in Scotland. And I think there was a number of excellent contributions. I thought Ben McPherson's contribution was absolutely spot on, because we're not going to address this crisis unless we look at all the issues. And there is a global context. There's a historical context. There was a move away from building social housing through the 80s and 90s. And perhaps he's right. You know, I think we could have done more when we were in power. But it's only by facing up those things that we can deal with this crisis. What I don't understand is why so many of his colleagues will acknowledge that this will feel like an emergency to so many, and yet don't want to recognise it as an emergency in this hotel. Happy to give away.
Paul Sweeney.
I thank my friend for giving me that point, making an excellent speech. One of the great strengths of Labour's housing policy in Scotland during the 1970s and 80s was building the Community Housing Association movement, which is increasingly seeing forced mergers, directed mergers at the behest of the Scottish housing regulators. Does he share my increasing alarm and concern at this trend in Scotland, most recently with Reid Vale Housing Association in Denniston?
Daniel Johnson.
I do indeed, and I think housing associations have faced an absolutely invidious position in recent years, finding it very difficult to invest in their housing stock. And critically, again on the numbers, fewer housing association dwellings have been built under the SNP on average per year than were under Labour. But and I also would thank Kate Forbes for her thoughtful contribution, and she's absolutely right. We do need to talk about solutions, and I don't think I disagree with a single one of the ones she set out, but in particularly on the planning point. Because yes, I think our members across the chamber have acknowledged the fact that there are financial pressures and there is a reality there, but there are also systemic pressures that we could relieve. We have to acknowledge the fact that the number of planners has dropped by a third in recent years. And until you have throughput in the planning system, we will struggle to approve the schemes we need to. Happy to give way.
Kate Forbes, briefly.
I just wonder, in the spirit of consensus that the member would agree, that one of the key concerns I have is that when a community group in particular is, for example, progressing plans for affordable housing, they often have to jump through the same hoops as a major corporate, for example, and we should ensure it's easier for them to get through the process.
Daniel Johnson.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think thinking about the throughput in the systems, making sure that we reflect the priorities, whether that's particular groups. I would also acknowledge the point that this is about, in the broader planning process, strategic infrastructure. I think treating all planning applications as the same, I don't think makes sense, and we need to look at that. And members across the chamber were asking, what are Labour solutions? Well, let me just gently remind them. We have made a commitment across the UK to build 1.5 million homes over 5 years. We will create a National Infrastructure Commission that will, through partnership, ensure that we lay the bedrock for that. We will ensure that house building and reform of the planning process is absolutely at the heart of ensuring that we can deliver those plans. And we will bring similar plans for, here in Scotland. But the simple reality is that nothing that the ministers have brought forward this afternoon really acknowledges that anything needs to be done differently. The motion and what they have said basically points to what has already been put in place, the plans that are already in effect, and saying that everything is fine. But the numbers tell you they are not fine. But they can't even decide on what numbers they want to choose. They disagree when we talk about private sector housing, yet the 130,000 figure that they quote includes private sector housing that they don't want us to talk about. It is a total nonsense and it's total confusion. And the simple reality is that the actions taken by the government are not enough. The housing situation and the crisis points to that, and until you fix supply, you will continue to have those problems.
No, Mr Johnson, I think you're beginning to...
The simple reality is, what we have heard from the government today is a set of excuses. Government is not about excuses. It's not about dodging the problems. It's about acknowledging the problems and coming up with an action plan to deal with them. We've had none of that, nothing new from the government benches today. There's been some questions recently about the mooted rebuttal unit that the SNP needs. They've already got it. The Scottish Government's sole purpose seems to be rebuttal. The problem is they're not very good at it. Whereas the Tories we have the chance of getting rid of in the coming months. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait 2.5 years until we can get rid of this sorry government. And until then, I am ashamed to say Scotland's going to have to put up with a government that seeks excuses rather than delivery. And that will be felt most when it comes to housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Johnson.